attendeth my way. When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control, that Christ has regarded my helpless estate, and hath shed his own blood for my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought. My sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And Lord, taste the day when the faith shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll, the trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul.
invite you to stay tuned for the live broadcast of the Wednesday evening Bible study of Mayfield Drive Baptist Church, located in Smyrna, Tennessee. We will now join the service.
All right, we welcome you back again this evening to our Wednesday evening Bible study at Mayfield Drive Baptist Church. And we are concluding with this lesson, part number 51 of the Chief. You realize this has been a year? It's been a year's study. And we've missed a few Wednesday nights, so it's actually been a little over a year. This is part 51. There are 52 weeks in the year, so with a few, 2 or 3 weeks, I think, that we missed. I was out 1 or 2 weeks, health problems, and then we had youth camp 1 week during the summer. And so there have been 2 or 3 Wednesdays that we have not, we didn't cover these lessons, but we've thus far covered with tonight 51 of these lessons. Now, when it gets into the manuscript, there won't be that many chapters in the book. This is going into a book, and it's well on its way. So anyway, that process will take another 2 or 3 months to get fully complete before the finished product comes out. But anyway, this will be the final part of the Chief. Paul writes 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews. Now, I do want to make a note here that your handout has more than what you're going to see on the screen. I had Jamie not to put the outlines of these in, at least 1st and 2nd Timothy, into the Proclaim, so they'll be on the slides, but you do have them in your handouts. So I'm just going to quickly go over those. Otherwise, we would not have time to finish up this evening. Our beginning text verse comes from 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the commandment of God our Savior and Lord Jesus Christ, which is our hope. So by way of introduction, at this point in Paul's life, it appears that he has been released from house arrest in Rome after his case failing to be heard. And remember, I've stated throughout that if a case did not come up that was scheduled with an appeal to the Caesar, if it didn't come up within 2 years, then it was dismissed. And what appears to be the case here, his case did not come up simply because his accusers, did not appear. They would have had to come from Judea and Jerusalem all the way to Rome. Well, they opted not to make that trip, so if his accusers are not there, his case is dismissed. So we believe this is what happened. The scriptures are not emphatic about that. In fact, we do not have any, except the barest of hints, what has happened. But we have to take some clues from some of his writings and from secular history to finish up what we're doing for this evening. It's believed that he is now in Spain or on his way, okay? He may not spend a lot of time in Spain, but that seems to be his final destination. This epistle is the first of 3 that are commonly called the pastoral epistles. If I'm not mistaken, the pastoral epistles is a seminary course that is later years, I think. Did you have that? I didn't. We didn't have a course like that, but I think it's pretty much a routine now course in seminaries. Yeah, it was still being written. Over here in the monkey section in the peanut gallery, one of the three monkeys over there is saying that these books weren't finished written by the time I went through seminary. Well, they were. Yeah. Anyway, they're a good study. They are a good study. The pastoral epistles include 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Okay? And so this is Paul's writings to these young preachers. I say young, not sure how old Titus was, but he wasn't as old as Paul was. Let's put it that way. He might have been middle-aged or pretty close to middle age. We don't know. Timothy, of course, was young. It's believed that Timothy first started out with Paul when he was about 18 or 19. And after being with Paul for many years, at this point in time, he is probably in his late 20s or so. That's just an estimate and a guess. Don't hold me to that. Charles Swindoll, I don't agree with everything that Charles Swindoll writes, but he writes the following concerning these letters. The first of Paul's final series of letters, which along with 2 Timothy and Titus are called the pastoral epistles. 1 Timothy offers practical and pastoral advice from the aging Apostle Paul to a young pastor named Timothy working in the church at Ephesus. More than a decade prior to writing this letter, Paul had first met Timothy in the city of Lystra in Asia Minor, where Timothy was known and respected by the Christians. You see that in Acts 16, verses 1 through 4. Upon recognizing Paul's impressive qualities, Timothy's impressive qualities, thank you, Paul recruited Timothy, okay? Paul recruited the young man to travel with him as he continued his second missionary journey. The presence of Timothy would have met an important need for Paul. Their friendship coming on the heels of Paul's split with his close friend and partner in missions, Barnabas. You can see that in Acts 15, verses 36 through 41. The Bible's silence on the ultimate fate of Paul has engendered a great deal of debate in modern times. You say, what do you mean? We do not know for sure what happened to Paul. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. The book of Acts ends with Paul sitting in a Roman prison awaiting his hearing before the Roman emperor, a privilege of appeal that all Roman citizens possess. And may I clarify, this Roman prison, he was not at this point in an actual prison. He had his own house, according to Scripture. He had his own house, a rented house. He was able to have people in. He was chained to a guard, a Roman guard, 24 hours a day, But yet, and he couldn't leave his house. Well, he would have, but he had to be escorted. But he did not have freedom. So, in essence, he, being under house arrest, he was in prison. Okay? However, the writing of the pastoral epistles clearly dates to a time after the events of Acts. Okay? So where was Paul when he wrote 1 Timothy? Good question, huh? If he's not in Rome, where is he? Paul had expected the Romans to release him from prison, something that likely happened near the end of AD 62. That's according to Philippians chapter 2, verse 24. Remember, this was one of the letters that Paul wrote during his house arrest in Rome. Incidentally, this date is probably pretty close to being what it actually was. But we still won't be dogmatic about it. His release allowed him the opportunity to travel to Ephesus and eventually place Timothy in ministry at that church. Paul then went on to preach in Macedonia, where he heard reports of Timothy's work at Ephesus that prompted him to write 1 Timothy, probably in AD 63. Okay? And there's my source. Now, in your notes, you have the outline of 1 Timothy, doctrine, the church, and pastor's salutation. Now, I purposely did not have Jamie to put all of these into the slides because it would take a lot of time to go through all of this. So I'm just going to skim through and just give you the highlights. As a salutation, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Then, beginning with verse 3 through 20, there is doctrine. Now remember, Paul is writing to the young preacher Timothy. Timothy is in Ephesus having to straighten some things out. So Paul is restating some doctrinal things. And in chapter 2, he addresses things concerning the church itself. Worship. He touches on prayer. Then he gets into women in public worship, how they can be dressed or should be dressed, and their deportment, and then services. And then he goes into officers in chapter 3 and their qualifications. And that includes deacons and their qualifications, and then reasons for instruction. Paul and Timothy's conduct, and then the greatness of the gospel. And then the third part of 2 Timothy, beginning with chapter 4, verse 1, running through the end of the book, would be pastoral duties. Pastoral duties. Proclaiming the truth. The good minister of Christ. Some of the things that a pastor should pay attention to. Shepherding the flock. Paul includes the old and the young. including Timothy's actions and reactions, I guess you would say, to the elders of the church and how that he should treat them and conduct in both directions. Then in chapter 6, Paul touches on slaves. Remember, slavery was a big thing in that day and time. And just because that a pastor or a child of God, a church member, a Christian, had slaves, that they should treat them in a certain manner. But also there was the side of how the slaves should react to their masters, how they should conduct themselves. And we saw some of that when we looked at the book of Philemon. Then he goes in the bulk of chapter 6, living a godly life, and dangers and duties that one needs to have, and then warning the worldly, and then guarding the trust, and then he closes with a benediction. So that brings us, there's a lot that could be looked at, and I have just barely skimmed over the surface of an outline concerning the book of 1 Timothy. Now, there's considerable debate about the final years of Paul's life after the close of Acts. It seems that Luke is no longer with Paul. We do not know where Luke is. But Luke no longer writes concerning the actions of Paul after that he is released. And in fact, Paul does not even verify the fact that Paul is, or that it is a fact that he is released from house arrest. So, this lacking clear clarification generates a heap of debate and discussion what really happened to the Apostle Paul after the close of the book of Acts. So here again, we have to go on hints in the writings of Paul himself, and also from recorded history in what happens to him. The most accepted theory that after 2 years of house arrest, Paul was released and allowed to travel again. During this fourth missionary journey, as some have called it, Paul traveled throughout the Mediterranean. Now, since that's the last word in that slide, I'll pause for just a minute to give time to get that written down. When it says the Mediterranean, it's talking about those countries surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, commonly called what we would say the Middle East today, or part of it anyway. All right, he writes concerning Macedonia in 1 Timothy 1:3, Troas, 2 Timothy 4:13, Miletus, 2 Timothy 4:20, Crete, Titus 1:5, Nicopolis, Titus 3:12, and then possibly Spain. He's been to these places before. And he's mentioned these cities and these places and countries in others of his writings that we have examined already. The early church father Clement asserted that Paul did fulfill his desire to go to Spain, expressed in Romans chapter 15, verse 28. But whether the visit actually took place is still uncertain. So we wouldn't be dogmatic about it. Eventually, Paul went back to Rome, but it may not have been voluntary. It has been suggested that Paul was arrested while in Nicopolis, but the evidence is uncertain. What we do know is that by the time Paul returned to Rome, the widespread persecution of Christians by Emperor Nero had already begun. It's entirely possible that by this time, the Apostle Peter had been martyred in Rome. And as we mentioned last week, we have no biblical evidence, at least that I'm aware, that Peter ever went to Rome. Tradition holds that Peter was martyred in Rome. When you talk about tradition, what did we say? Sorry?
Just word of mouth.
Word of mouth. There's no way to be absolutely sure about it. It's been passed down, many times originated by the Catholic Church. But there's no evidence that Peter and Paul were in Rome at the same time, as the Catholic Church says. So if Peter, evidence points to Peter being in another part of the world during this time. But the persecution of the Christians was empire-wide. So if Peter was martyred in Rome, then he had to be brought to Rome in order for that to happen. You say, can you be absolutely certain of that? No. But that the probability is that's what it was. Paul's imprisonment this time, excuse me, was not house arrest. In other words, he didn't have it easy like he did the first time. He had a certain amount of freedom the first time under house arrest. He could have people to come in. He could send things out. It's possible, we don't know for sure, but he might have been able to go out as long as he was escorted and being chained to guards, at least one guard, 24 hours a day. He certainly wasn't going to be able to get away. But this time, there was no house arrest. Rather, it's believed to have been in the cold, infamous Mamertine prison, where Peter might also have been held. Now, one thing about these prisons, a person wasn't sentenced to prison for X number of years or months. Prisons functioned to hold people in custody until they could be executed or freed. Getting out of a prison in this day and time, you either were freed or you were executed. One or the other. We do have some information about Paul's final days based on Paul's last letter to Timothy. From this very personal, heartfelt letter, we know that Paul was visited by Onesiphorus. Now, I pronounced this fine before. Onesiphorus, who often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains, Paul says in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. But we, also know that Paul had been abandoned by many Christians as he faced trial. It's in chapter 4, verses 10 and 16. Luke alone was still with Paul, although Paul expressed the hope that he would see John Mark again when Timothy came to visit, 2 Timothy 4:11. Paul writes to Timothy, that Luke is with him there in the prison. So did Luke go with him in these travels to Macedonia and then into Spain and followed him back again, or was he someplace else and then heard that Paul was imprisoned again and then went back to Paul? We don't know. We don't know. We have no way of knowing. Historical evidence agrees that Paul was executed in Rome, probably by beheading, sometime between AD 66 and 68. To believe Paul, that's got to spend at least 2 years free before he was rearrested and then brought back to Rome. So these dates figure in pretty closely to what we do know concerning Paul. But that did not put an end to his ministry. Though his letters in the New Testament, or through his letters in the New Testament and his detailed story in Acts, Paul still ministers to us today. And there you see my source for this. Now, an overview of 2 Timothy is what you have next. And there are some key words that appear in this particular book. This book is personal. It is not what I don't want to use the word pastoral because it still is. But it's on more of a personal level, like compared to Philemon. Philemon was a personal letter from Paul to Philemon. And this is a letter from an elder pastor to a younger pastor. So it's very personal. And there are key words. There are some key words in this. First is not ashamed. Suffer hardship. Endure. Word. Charge. Diligence. All of these are key words that are found in this epistle of 2 Timothy. And chapter 1 is like it covers the past. Chapter 2, the present. Not our present, of course, but their present. When he was talking to Timothy, encouraging Timothy, and giving him some pointers, if you will, and some tips on not just being a Christian, but a pastor. And then chapter 3 concerns the future. Here is where Paul gets into the warning of apostasy, the perilous times and the servant of God, trustworthiness of the Scriptures, fully equipped man of God. Chapter 4 continues with the future, and it gives Paul's last will and testament, or his parting words. And he gives a charge for Timothy to keep. And then he draws a comparison. The wrestler, the runner, the century soldier in verses 6 through 8. And then he talks about the victory ahead and the benediction. So as you can tell, these things that Paul wrote to Timothy in the second letter are a bit different than the first letter. So that brings us now to the epistle of Titus, the letter to Titus. The epistle to Titus was written by the Apostle Paul to Titus in approximately 66 AD, around the same time frame as the first letter to Timothy. In other words, Titus appears between 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. Paul didn't write 2 Timothy until he was back in Rome again, in prison. And it would be his final writing. That would be the last thing that he wrote. The second letter to Timothy. And it's believed that Titus, he wrote to Titus in Crete right after that he wrote the first letter to Timothy. Now, these are two men who are in two different difficult locations. Paul was an aging man at this point, shortly before his final imprisonment. Titus was on Crete and was sent there by Paul to establish leadership within the churches. This letter, unlike the letters to Timothy, was all business. there was not the personal relationship that we see present in the writings to Timothy. Because Titus had a different relationship to Paul than, of course, Timothy did. Timothy came up under Paul's tutelage. Timothy had Paul as his mentor, if you will, to put it in modern day vernacular. Titus was a Gentile, no doubt saved under the ministry of Paul, and was taught by Paul, was trained by Paul. But the relationship was different. Paul looked on Timothy as his own son, which he probably did not have. But he considered Timothy to be his son in the ministry, if you will. This letter was written in a pattern of command, rationale, and charge. The first section on leadership is based on the false leader's deception. There were some problems in Crete. And Titus was there to straighten it out. The next two sections on right conduct are based on the rationale of God's grace, mercy, and its provisions. Titus was a Greek, non-Jewish convert to Christianity. He was not a Jew. Most likely, Titus, like Timothy, came to faith under Paul's teaching. Titus had traveled with Paul, and Paul trusted Titus. And at one point, and I forget which it is now, Titus may have been the penman for one of the letters that Paul wrote. But Titus had been with Paul, I think I said in one of them, in one of our lessons, about been with Paul almost 20 years, something like that. So Titus had been with Paul for a long time. Perhaps Paul chose Titus to be the one to reach Crete because he was once a Greek Gentile and would better understand what was going on in the culture of the day. Titus is mentioned 13 times in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians 2:13, 7:6, verses 13 and 14, chapter 8, verse 6 and 16 and 23, chapter 12 and verse 18, and two different times. And then he's mentioned in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 1 and verse 3, and then in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 10. Titus was to preach the same gospel message Paul was preaching. He wasn't to change it or to add to it. Perhaps the methodology would be different in the deliverance, but the gospel was never to change. Isn't that the way that it is today? We have the same message, but I guarantee you my delivery and my methodology is different than Brother Bernie's, and then Brother Jamie's, or Brother Dan Curtis, or Brother Glenn Davenport. We each, shall we say, we preach the same things. We have the same methods, but we are all different personalities. We are all different men. We have different methods many times in doing things. the message remains the same. Titus didn't change the message. Because of the culture and because that he was a Gentile, he may have had a different way in presenting the gospel to these Christians, but it was the same message. When I preached in Jamaica, I didn't preach like I preached here. If I preached here like I did in Jamaica, you'd think I was a crazy man. Okay? But I conformed to basically to the culture and the way that the Jamaicans were. They understood what I was saying. They understood the message. They understood my mythology. The message was the same. Yes, ask Jeremy. He can be a witness to that. To that. He's seen me, quote unquote, in action in the pulpit in Jamaica. Yeah, it's been many years ago now. And suffice it to say, if I went back there now, I would be different than what I was then because I'm older. Paul was adamant in his letter to Titus that Titus must never waver or compromise on sound doctrine. Nor should we. The book of Titus is only 3 chapters long with 46 verses in total. So let's look at this setting. A group from Crete had been in Jerusalem during the Passover at the birth of the Christian church. That was at Pentecost. And of course, now we know, I'm quoting now, okay? We know that the church did not start on the day of Pentecost. However, there probably were some Christians there, all right? And as we have seen before, after Pentecost, because of persecution, they were scattered, which meant they went back home where they should have gone to in the first place. Acts 2:11 says both Jews and converts to Judaism, Christians and Arabs, and we all hear these people speaking in our own language about the wonderful things God has done. As you can tell, that's not from the King James. Some may have taken their faith back to the island of Crete. But Paul mentions to Titus in chapter 1 and verse 5 that Paul was leaving Titus on the island to complete the work they had started there. Paul is moving on, but he's leaving Titus behind to finish things up. The only other time Crete is mentioned in the New Testament is in Acts 27, when Paul was being transported to Rome via ship to face trial. You remember they put into Crete. Scholars believe that Paul's work in Crete began after the events of Acts 28. His trial and subsequent 2 years' worth of preaching in Rome, and before his final imprisonment. Paul began the church in Crete without appointing leaders. You remember in every other place, when Paul moved on, that's what generally happened as he planted churches. He left leadership behind to take over. In Crete, Paul gave Titus the responsibility to appoint these leaders, and Paul outlined what the leadership needed to look like. The culture in Crete was negatively influencing this young church. False teachers were present. Titus needed to get the church in order before the arrival of Artemas and Tychus. These were two other brethren that were coming to Crete, apparently maybe to relieve Titus. Titus needed to assign elders in each city, which indicates to me that there was more than one church there. When this had been completed, Titus would meet up with Paul and move on. And there you see my sources. Now let's look at the outline of the book of Titus. Chapter 1, we have the divine order for churches. Verses 1 through 5, we have the greetings and hope. Verse 6, setting in order things, locking and ordaining the elders. Verses 7 through 9, Paul gives the qualifications on and duties of bishops. And when you think about the situation here, and most of the time we put Titus together with this basic same account concerning the duties and qualifications of pastors and deacons that Paul sets forth to Timothy. A lot of times we put them together. But when you isolate them and you think about Titus is on his own by himself with his work in Crete, it takes on a new meaning, takes on a different view. Chapter 2 looks at the pastoral duties for age levels or doctrine. The aged men in verse 2, the aged women in verse 3, the younger women, verses 4 and 5, the younger men in verses 6 through 8, and then servants in verses 9 and 10. Then the saving, separation, and working grace in verses 11 and 12. Looking for the blessed hope, verses 13 and 15. Then that brings us to chapter 3. Paul gets into respect for civil government, verses 1, 2, and 3. Salvation revealed by mercy and grace, verses 4 through 7. Maintaining good works, verse 8. Avoiding contentions and strivings, etc., verses 9 through 11. And then the final greetings and exhortations in verses 12 through 15. Any questions or comments before we get into the conclusion, which is rather lengthy? Yes, ma'am.
Just think about what we would have to kind of ascertain what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to do it, if we didn't have Paul to tell us about with God's direction what to do today, because it would be totally different than what the Hebrews and all of the others would do. That wouldn't suit us at all, where we're a totally different group.
Right?
And so it is, you think about it, well, what would we have done?
With Paul's practical instructions to these preachers, we have the bulk of details that we as pastors and preachers need to know, and also other church leadership would be lacking. Our knowledge would be lacking without these 3 books. Doctrine is covered in Paul's other letters beyond the shadow of a doubt. But then Paul brings it down to practical things with these two preachers. How do you present the gospel? How do you do this? How do you do that? So with these pastoral epistles, we have a completion of what God called men should be doing. All right, conclusion. Did Paul write Hebrews? Good question. It is possible Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, and I'll state my belief, and this is strictly Robert's theology, and you know what you can do with that Paul was the author of the book. However, we don't know for sure. There's a couple of reasons why this might be the case, that he is the author of the book of Hebrews. First, in the earliest manuscript editions of New Testament books, Hebrews is included after Romans among the books written by the Apostle Paul. This was taken as evidence that Paul had written it. And some Eastern churches accepted Hebrews as canonical earlier than in the West. Second, both Clement of Alexandria, lived from 150 to 215 AD, and Origen, 185 to 253, claimed a Pauline association for the book, but recognized that Paul himself probably did not put pen to paper for this book, even though they did not know the author's name. Then that is not a whole lot different than the other books that Paul wrote. The only one that we really have evidence that Paul wrote in his own hand is Philemon. In some of the other books, he would close them out, but others did the actual penmanship, putting down what Paul dictated to them. Clement of Alexandria suggests that Paul wrote the book originally in Hebrew and that Luke translated it into Greek, though the Greek of Hebrews bears no resemblance to translation Greek, that of the Septuagint. Now that would not surprise me, because Luke would have probably spoken a little bit different Greek than the Koine because of his education. And I say that because he was a doctor. The Greek being the more common Greek? Koine is the common, yes. The King James Version assumes Pauline authorship. The non-position of the authorship questioned by the Alexandrian fathers was obscured by a later church tradition that mistook Pauline association for Pauline authorship. Just because something was related and associated with Paul does not necessarily mean that Paul wrote it. There are other books that have been written that are not considered to be part of the canon of Scriptures. Do you know what I mean when I say canon of Scriptures?
The accepted collection.
Sorry?
The accepted collection.
All right, the accepted collection. In other words, all of these books of the Bible were taken and were put in order. That's another lesson and study within itself. But of course, that was done many years afterwards. But there were books that were rejected as being canonical because there were some questions about their authorship. Now, Barnabas wrote some things, or is supposed to have written things, okay? And other men have supposedly written things that were not included in the canon of Scriptures, but yet could be associated with Paul. You follow me? The enormously influential King James Bible took its cue from this tradition. In fact, in the KJV, you'll find the title translated as it was found in some manuscripts, the Epistle of Paul to the Apostle, Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews. The tradition of Pauline authorship continued. The most persuasive argument against Pauline authorship. So let's look at that. I presented one side of it. Let's look at the other side. An even more persuasive argument that the Apostle Paul was not the author of Hebrews is the way the author alludes to himself in Hebrews 2:3, stating that the gospel was continued, quote unquote, to us. Confirmed to us by those who heard the Lord announce salvation. The Apostle Paul always made the point that even though he wasn't one of the 12 original disciples who walked with Jesus during his earthly life, he called himself, what was it? The apostle born out of due time? Yes. He was nonetheless an apostle of Jesus Christ and usually identifies himself as such in his letters. And yes, he does. Seems unlikely that Paul here in chapter 2 and verse 3 would refer to himself as someone who received the gospel from those who had heard the Lord. Good argument. So with that, we close our study on the life of the Apostle Paul, the chief. Questions? Comments? Grant says, yay!
We here at International Missionary Baptist Ministries are so thankful that you chose to watch or listen to this Wednesday evening Bible study. We will be broadcasting again at this same time next week. If you wish to contact us, we can be reached via email at imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Our mailing address is International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee, 37167. Again, I repeat, our email address is imbr@imbmpodcasts.com. Podcast is plural there. Our snail mail is International Missionary Baptist Radio, P.O. Box 1676, Smyrna, Tennessee, 37167. We thank you so very much for watching or listening. We hope that this was a blessing to you.